Welcome very much to this Meet the Researchers for March this year with Jessica Brown. Unfortunately, this is going to be Jessica's last performance for us, as she is she and her husband are departing to Europe and other parts for up to 2 years. I've told her that's really not a good thing, but what could I do about that? There's not a lot I can. Yes, yes. But for the time being, and for the rest of this month at least, she's a research fellow at the CIS. And she's been focusing on population, family policy, welfare reform, disability pensions, parental leave and foreign policy. In fact, today she was saying that she'd got interviewed by some journalist about the first thing she started talking about when she came here over 3 years ago, which was on various paid parental leave schemes. In this case it was the opposition scheme, because it's been a bit in the press because there's a bit of dissent, rightly so, within the opposition about the scheme. Her most recent report, working towards self-reliance, 3 lessons for disability reforms, has been very important. In fact, I don't think people understand just how much the work that she and, prior to Jess, Peter Saunders did to cut through the sort of partisan debates about these. I mean, most people now who think seriously about the need to reform the disability support arrangements know that they have to do something, and I think Jess and Peter before her can take credit for a lot of that. In September last year, she released with Oliver Hartwich, was it last year? Why Growing Australia is Nothing to Fear, which was dealing with population, and then it's been a long series of publications dealing with the questions of population and why a larger Australia is nothing to be feared of. In Jakarta's Juggling Act, she explored Indonesia's foreign policy in the context of a shifting regional balance of power, and with a new foreign minister heading for Canberra soon, I assume he got approved by the Parliament this afternoon, he clearly has an interest in making sure that the relationships between Australia and our near neighbours to the north and also out into the Pacific are better than they have been. Jess comments regularly in the media on social policy issues in particular. She's been published in just about every major newspaper in the country, has been on The Drum and Q&A on the ABC, on the Today Tonight, and on the radio regularly. She holds a Masters of International Studies from the University of Sydney, and prior to that an Honours BA from the University of Melbourne, where she majored in political science. So please welcome, at least for the moment, the last time, to this stage, Jessica Brown.
Thank you, Greg. That was the longest introduction I've ever had, so I'm glad that we can finish it. Okay, hi everybody. As Greg mentioned, over the last few years I've been working on a huge range of different policy issues, but tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about Southeast Asian foreign policy, and this is a particular interest for me and something that Greg lets me indulge. November last year, US President Barack Obama made his first long-awaited official visit to Australia. Any visit by an American president is considered momentous, but this visit held special significance. With wars in Iraq and Afghanistan winding down, and the global centre of economic gravity shifting to Asia, Obama came to Australia not just to bolster our alliance, but with a message to sell. Obama was here to talk about America's strategic pivot towards the Asia-Pacific. Now, he used this visit to announce an increase in American troops stationed in Darwin, but his speech in Canberra was certainly not just targeted at Australians. It was carefully crafted for a wider Asian audience. Obama wanted the region to know that America was back. His Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, had begun to outline America's strategic policy shift towards Asia a few weeks earlier. In a cover story for the magazine Foreign Policy, she declared that one of the most important tasks of American statecraft over the next decade will be to lock in substantially increased investment, diplomatic, economic, strategic and otherwise. In the Asia-Pacific region, we are prepared to lead. Yet, despite all this talk of building diplomatic and trade ties, of democracy building and joint disaster relief efforts, it was quite clear what Obama and Clinton's real rationale was. America's shift is a declaration that it's prepared to meet the strategic challenge posed by a rapidly growing China. Obama wants to reassure countries throughout Asia who are worried about the implications of China's rise, of America's commitment to maintain its primacy in the region. Now, one significant aspect of America's renewed focus, and one that we'll look at tonight, is Southeast Asia. America has long been the preponderant military power in Southeast Asia. But since the end of the Cold War, it's been dogged by the perception that its interest in the region has waned, and this perception was not helped by Washington's focus on terrorism and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, with the centre of geopolitical gravity shifting towards Asia, America is keen to once again bolster its leadership credentials. The question for the US is, will its pivot work? Will Asian countries naturally gravitate towards China as its power grows, rendering America an increasingly irrelevant power? So far, in Southeast Asia at least, the answer is no. As China has grown to become the region's leading economic power, and debate swirls about whether it will become the region's leading military power, Southeast Asian states have not moved closer to Beijing. Quite the reverse. Almost all have deepened their interactions with the United States. This is not because they're attracted to America's liberal democratic light on the hill. There's a slow drift towards democracy in Southeast Asia, but it looks quite different to the US version, and indeed it looks quite different across the region. No, Southeast Asian states are embracing America for a much more realist reason. They wanted to act as a counterweight to a quickly strengthening China. Now, Southeast Asian countries vary in their level of intimacy with the US, and it's far too simplistic just to think of their relationships with America and China as a clear-cut dichotomy. But I'd like to argue tonight that all countries in Southeast Asia genuinely welcome America's re-engagement in their region. Why? Well, like Australia, they've all benefited immensely from the existing order. They can trade with China and get lifted by the rising tide of its economic boom. They can also free-ride on America's implicit security guarantee, meaning they can get on with the job of development without having to worry about waging costly wars. This model has served the region well for a number of decades, so it's not surprising that Southeast Asian governments judge that their interests are best served by the maintenance of this status quo. They know that as small countries, they only have limited power to affect this, but they also know that an actively engaged America is a necessary prerequisite. Southeast Asian states have significant differences in their strategic alignments, something we'll talk about tonight, but their strategy for managing regional security is essentially the same. All are engaged with both the United States and China, but to quite different degrees. All hope that if they build good bilateral relations with both major powers, neither will be able to dominate their region. Southeast Asian countries have become adept at playing China and America off against each other, leaning more closely towards one, even if only in rhetorical terms, when they dislike the behaviour of the other or judge that its power is becoming too great. Despite all the talk of America's decline, Beijing has not built the moral authority or trust it needs to replace the US as a hegemon in Southeast Asia. In fact, China's increasingly nationalist rhetoric is beginning to put its neighbours offside. All Southeast Asian countries want to take advantage of the benefits of a rising China, yet none want Beijing to be able to politically dominate the region. Before getting further into the discussion, it's worth just defining exactly what Southeast Asia is. What we're looking at here is a map of the 10 countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, bordered by Australia to the south, China to the north. There's a bit of debate about whether Southeast Asia is 10 or 11 countries, because there's discussion about whether Timor-Leste, formerly East Timor, will be admitted into the association. I'll just throw some numbers at you just to give you an idea of the huge diversity of this region. Indonesia, the largest country in Australia's northern neighbour, has a population of almost 250 million people. It's the fourth most populous country in the world. And it's a relatively poor country. Per capita GDP in purchasing power terms of just over $4,000 a year, but because of its sheer size, it's really being touted as one of the major emerging economies in the world. Then you've got countries like Singapore, one of the biggest economic success stories ever. A tiny little city-state, population of less than 5 million people, but per capita GDP in terms of purchasing power of $62,000. Countries like the Philippines, population of 100 million people, Vietnam, 90 million people. These are all countries that are trying to move into middle income status and trying to move up the development ladder. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got Burma, which is sometimes called Myanmar, one of the poorest countries in the world, with a per capita GDP of $1,400, but a huge population of nearly 55 million people. So it's an incredibly diverse region that we're talking about. The countries in this region that most welcome America's presence are the maritime states, which you can see around the edge of the map. Countries such as Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines. These countries hope that a strongly engaged USA will have a restraining effect on China's maritime ambitions. And as you can see, the little bit of China that doesn't have its name on it, Hainan Island, is where the Chinese PLA Navy is developing a lot of its forces. Now, these countries, the mainland Southeast Asian countries, are far closer to the United States. Sorry, the maritime Southeast Asian countries are far closer to the United States than their mainland neighbours. This is partly for historic reasons. America has always been a maritime power in Southeast Asia and consciously built relations with maritime states. It's also partly economic. The maritime states tend to be the largest and most economically developed countries in Southeast Asia, making them much more integrated into the global economy and more active on the world stage. But the main reason that the maritime states welcome America's renewed engagement with their region is strategic. And this is primarily, at the moment, because of the South China Sea, which is that big patch of white you can see between Vietnam and the Philippines. The South China Sea is a maritime bridge between the Indian and Pacific Oceans and the geographic centre of Southeast Asia. 1/3 of global maritime traffic, including 80% of China's crude oil supplies, passes through the sea. There's an estimated 7 million barrels of oil and 900 trillion cubic feet of natural gas lying under the seabed. So as you can see, any state that manages to control even part of the South China Sea could potentially wield great economic and military power over the entire region, making it a substantial strategic prize. Now, China and several Southeast Asian countries claim overlapping parts of the sea, but until recently, all have seemed happy to let the conflict lie dormant. There have been a few brief flare-ups, such as clashes between China and what was then South Vietnam in 1974. But none of the claimants have wanted to risk overt conflict by forcefully defending their claims. And up until now, none have had the force projection capability to do so either. But in 2009, China stoked tension when it lodged a map with the United Nations, which included a claim over almost all of the South China Sea, including waters that fell well within its neighbours' exclusive economic zone. And you can see the red line on the map, which indicates China's claim. China also reportedly called the sea a core national interest, putting it on a par with Tibet and Taiwan. It later backed away from this claim, but the damage was done. Adding fuel to the fire, Chinese official statements and press reports became increasingly nationalistic and even belligerent, and hostility has intensified even further since then. In mid-2011, the Vietnamese government claimed Chinese patrol vessels had deliberately severed cables being dragged by a Vietnamese oil exploration ship. A few months later, the Philippines alleged that Chinese vessels had harassed Filipino boats operating just 79 kilometres off their coast. There remains consistent low-level provocation on all sides. Just a few days ago, Vietnam alleged that Chinese forces assaulted Vietnamese fishermen seeking shelter from a storm. Last week, the Philippines confirmed that it would push ahead with oil exploration in disputed waters. Everyone agrees that the goal is ensuring freedom of navigation, but there are concerns that China interprets this differently to the US and to other countries, and could seek to block access to foreign ships if it controlled part of the sea. Only a few years ago, Southeast Asian countries had largely seen China as a benign and friendly potential regional leader. But now they worry about what Beijing's real intentions might be. Even countries such as Singapore and Indonesia, who are not directly involved in the South China Sea disputes themselves, worry about the precedent that would be set if China were able to expand its influence in the sea. Would China then turn its attention to other strategically important waterways, such as the narrow Malacca Straits, which you can see down in the very left-hand corner of the map? This is a very thin strait separating Indonesia, Singapore and Malaysia, considered to be one of two global choke points for energy supplies. The other is the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East. Perhaps not surprisingly, all maritime Southeast Asian states have responded to China's increased assertiveness in the South China Sea by strengthening ties with the United States. The history of America's engagement with Vietnam and the Philippines is almost diametrically opposite. Yet both these countries, on the front line of these disputes, have eagerly increased cooperation with Washington over the past 3 years. Vietnam, in particular, has seen a major shift in its policy towards the US. America suspended diplomatic relations with Vietnam in 1975, and these weren't re-established for another 20 years in 1995. Since the war, dubbed the American War by Hanoi, anti-American sentiment has run strong in some parts of Vietnamese society, but nevertheless, security cooperation has increased in leaps and bounds since the mid-2000s. In 2010, the destroyer USS John McCain made an historic and highly symbolic visit to the port of Da Nang to mark the 15th anniversary of restored relations. The same year, the United States Quadrennial Defence Review stated America's desire to build a comprehensive partnership with Vietnam. Then last year, despite protests from China, American naval ships visited Vietnamese ports for joint training exercises. Now, Hanoi remains conscious not to get Beijing offside, and it's careful that its relationship with the US doesn't in any way outpace its relationship with China. But it's quite striking to look at the enthusiasm with which Vietnam has welcomed America's overtures, especially given the relative newness of the relationship. It's a striking symbol of just how much maritime Southeast Asian states hope that America's presence in the South China Sea and in the region will help keep China's maritime ambitions in check. Now, unlike Vietnam, the Philippines has been a formal military ally of the United States since the 1950s, but also the relationship has not always been smooth. In the 1990s, Manila requested that Washington remove its bases from Filipino soil, and a constitutional ban on American bases or foreign bases remains to this day. But now, with tensions running high in the South China Sea, Manila has, probably more than any country in Southeast Asia, vocally welcomed America's strategic re-engagement in the region. And because the Philippines is America's only treaty ally in maritime Southeast Asia, it also has an alliance relationship with Thailand, the Obama administration has really been particularly careful to reassure Manila of its ongoing commitment. In November, while Obama was in Canberra, it didn't hit the headlines here as much, but Clinton was at the same time in the Philippines, and she made a symbolically charged appearance on the decks of an American warship in Filipino waters in the South China Sea, promising Manila new Coast Guard vessels to help it patrol the area. Just a few weeks ago, America handed a second ship to Manila, and these have already been deployed in the disputed waters. The maritime Southeast Asian states have certainly had very different relationships with America in the past, and they continue to do so. But the degree to which they are now clamouring to strengthen ties with the US is strikingly uniform. In contrast to their maritime neighbours, mainland Southeast Asian states, and I might just flick back to the map so you can see what I'm talking about, mainland Southeast Asian states such as Burma, Cambodia and Laos have a much weaker relationship with the United States. Small, poor states they often have little choice but to fall very closely within China's economic orbit, and they necessarily see their relationship with Washington as of secondary importance to their relationship with Beijing. Yet they are strengthening their relationships with America too, even if it is from a very different starting point. Burma's recent strategic shift is emblematic of just how much all Southeast Asian states are worrying about China and want America to play the role of balancer. America cut ties with Burma after a brutal military coup in 1988. Burma has since then maintained a close friendship with China and cooperated with its Southeast Asian neighbours, joining ASEAN in 1997. But throughout this time, it's been shunned by Western countries who are horrified by its abysmal human rights record. America and the West still maintain extensive military and economic sanctions against the Burmese regime. But small steps towards reform in Burma since 2011 have led to a thaw in relations with the US. Some political prisoners have been released, and there are signs that restrictions on the press may be lifted. Perhaps most symbolically, the enigmatic democracy activist Aung San Suu Kyi has been released from house arrest and is being allowed to campaign for upcoming by-elections. Washington has responded by cautiously beginning to rebuild ties. In December, Hillary Clinton visited the country, and then in January, the US appointed its first ambassador to Burma in over 20 years, and Washington's currently considering whether to lift sanctions. Burma is essentially a client state of Beijing and has even mockingly been dubbed the 23rd province of China. But this strategic shift is seen as a move to distance itself from Beijing's orbit. In October, the Burmese government cancelled a controversial Chinese-backed hydroelectric dam, a major infrastructure project that was wildly unpopular in Burma, and this move was widely seen as a snub to Beijing. Recent political reforms are seen as an olive branch towards the West, and Burma's budding relationship with America could embolden the regime to move further away from China, depriving Beijing of its only real ally in Southeast Asia. Now, these changes shouldn't be overplayed. Burma still remains by far the closest of any of the ASEAN states to China, and its relationship with the United States is a very, very long way from being close. But Burma's changing strategic posture, which took most commentators by surprise, is remarkably symbolic. Even the most pro-Beijing of all the Southeast Asian states appear worried about the implications of China's rise and see the benefit of America's renewed engagement. Nevertheless, no Southeast Asian countries are willing to be seen as too critical of China, even those that have very close relationships with the United States. They may be nervous about what China's rise might mean, but they certainly don't want China to feel like it's isolated or feel like it's being contained. There is no appetite in Southeast Asia for stoking US-China strategic competition. In fact, it's overt conflict between the two is their worst nightmare. Yet they know that to keep China's relative power in check, its level of engagement in the region must be matched by the United States. Explicit balancing against China is rare. No Southeast Asian countries have signed formal alliances with the US since the 1950s. But all Southeast Asian states, to varying degrees, try to hedge their bets by building close relationships with China and the US, along with other regional powers such as India and Japan. Southeast Asian states, more than anything, don't want to have to choose sides between China and the US, judging that building close relationships with both is the best way to prevent conflict with either. And they certainly don't want to be estranged from China in the event that it grows to become the region's leading preponderant regional power. Singapore probably exemplifies this hedging strategy best. It pursues deep engagement with both America and China. Singapore is a vocal and unwavering supporter of America and has the closest ties with the US of any of its neighbours, even though it's not a formal alliance partner. But Singapore has also long pursued a policy of complex interdependence with China. it's consistently supported China's entry into regional multilateral forums, arguing that enmeshing China in the regional architecture is the best way to ensure its rise is peaceful. There's no appetite in Southeast Asia for excluding China in any way. Even Singapore's economic relationship with China and America is quite finely balanced. China received 10% of Singapore's exports in 2010, America 6%. The US is Singapore's largest source of inbound foreign direct investment, China its largest source of outbound FDI. Now that all the major Southeast Asian states pursue this type of hedging strategy is actually in everyone's interest. The Southeast Asian states themselves minimise the risk of being drawn into conflict with either of the major powers, and they also minimise the risk of being caught in the middle of conflict between the major powers. American political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski argues that it's also in China's interests that its neighbours pursue this type of hedging strategy. China, as much as any country in Asia, has also benefited from the stability brought about by America's implicit security guarantee, which has allowed it to develop not only its economy, but also its military power without being bogged down in regional conflicts. Southeast Asian hedging strategies, according to Brzezinski's logic, have a peace dividend because they allow both China and its neighbours to quietly pursue their own self-interest without overt conflict emerging. Now, Southeast Asian states are conscious that they can only successfully execute this hedging strategy if America makes its presence in the region felt, so long as it's careful not to stoke tensions or upset the carefully aligned balance of power. It's for this reason that Indonesian Foreign Minister Marty Nadalegawa, like some other Southeast Asian leaders, expressed concern about America's expanded troop commitment in Darwin, announced last November. Now, Nadalegawa didn't say that he's opposed to America's broader shift towards Asia, or even that he opposed the troop deployment. On the contrary, he's a leading supporter of America in the region. But what he worried was, and this is a quote, that it might create a vicious circle of tension and mistrust. He is well aware that his government's and his neighbours' strategy of engaging both China and the United States will backfire if it means that both major powers are drawn into a cycle of provocation. Southeast Asian leaders such as Singapore's Foreign Minister K. Shanmugam have made it clear that they despair of the anti-China rhetoric in US domestic debates, which runs completely counter to their engagement strategies. Mitt Romney's, for example, tough rhetoric on China in the current Republican primaries would no doubt be scaring Southeast Asian diplomats absolutely witless. The further China and America go in provoking each other, the harder it becomes to preserve the current status quo, and the harder it becomes for Southeast Asian countries to pursue their finely balanced engagement and hedging strategy. Now, foreign policy realists are often quick to brush off multilateral engagement, but it is quite important for Southeast Asian states because it does complement this hedging strategy so well. What it means is that they can engage both China and America without ruffling others' feathers, and engage both in resolving thorny security issues, like the South China Sea, without stoking head-on tensions between them. Southeast Asian states especially welcome America's strategic pivot towards the region because of its multilateral element. Historically, America's been much more keenly focused on bilateral cooperation in Southeast Asia, and its strategy has long been dubbed the hub and spokes model, with America in the middle and all of its allies sitting around the outside. Up until a few years ago, it was heavily criticised throughout Southeast Asia for its very half-hearted attempt at engaging with multilateral security forums. But in what has really looks now like a precursor to Obama's recently articulated strategic shift, America has spent the last few years quite significantly expanding its multilateral efforts within Southeast Asia. In 2008, Washington appointed its first ambassador to ASEAN. In 2009, Hillary Clinton signed ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which was created to encourage peaceful dispute resolution throughout Southeast Asia. At the 2010 ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi, Clinton offered to mediate in the South China Sea disputes and threw her support behind the ASEAN-backed multilateral negotiation track. And then in 2011, Obama became the first American president to attend the East Asia Summit, a region-wide security dialogue chaired and convened by ASEAN. Obama flew straight from Australia, where he made his major troop announcement, to Indonesia to attend the summit, symbolically highlighting the importance of multilateral engagement in America's pivot strategy. Here, he joined the majority of ASEAN states, excluding Burma and Cambodia, in speaking about the South China Sea issue, and, in the words of one commentator, skillfully coordinated a pushback against China's assertiveness. Now, ASEAN, like its member states, is ultimately realist. It has been criticised as a talk shop, and in many ways it is, but these criticisms also miss a fundamental point. By facilitating the maintenance of the regional balance of power, ASEAN serves a vital informal function in promoting regional stability. By involving other regional powers such as China and the US in multilateral dialogue, and China and US are by no means the only powers that are involved in these dialogues, Southeast Asian states use ASEAN as part of their strategy to ensure China's rise is as peaceful as possible. The relatively powerless countries, who are in a region that's long been dominated by great powers, and most have an experience with colonialism, believe that by putting ASEAN at the centre of regional diplomacy, they can deal themselves into a security discussion that they would otherwise be excluded from. This has always been ASEAN's purpose: to prevent quarrels between Southeast Asian states, but most importantly, to shield Southeast Asia from great power domination, remembering that the organisation was established in the height of the Cold War. Now, China has long advocated an exclusively East Asian model of multilateral cooperation that excludes the United States. And until very recently, several Southeast Asian states agreed. But their recent eagerness to welcome America into regional forums suggests that they now believe American cooperation in these multilateral forums is needed to balance against China's growing weight. Now, for the maritime Southeast Asian states, who you'll recall most keenly welcome America's engagement in the region, for these states it was particularly important that the US cement its influence in multilateral forums, such as the East Asia Summit, by the end of 2011. The chair of ASEAN is a rotating position, which is held for 1 year, and the chair hosts the East Asia Summit and a number of other ASEAN offshoot meetings, including the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is an important security dialogue for foreign ministers. In 2010, the ASEAN chair was Vietnam, and in 2011, it was Indonesia, both maritime countries that strongly welcome America's presence as a counterbalance to China. So perhaps it's no coincidence that Hillary Clinton, first became involved in the South China Sea dispute at the 2010 ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi, or that the same year America was invited to join the East Asia Summit. Both Vietnam and Indonesia advocate greater US involvement in regional multilateral security dialogues, and tellingly, both also advocate a multilaterally negotiated solution to the South China Sea dispute. In contrast, the 2012 chair, Cambodia, is a mainland country which is much closer to China in its strategic alignment. Cambodia is heavily dependent on China for aid and investment. China provided $6 billion in investment and a further $2 billion in non-conditional loans and aid to Cambodia between 2006 and 2010. Which doesn't sound much until you consider that Cambodia's total GDP in 2010 was $11 billion. So this is a significant proportion of GDP. As you can imagine, this has led to questions about how much political influence Beijing has in Phnom Penh. Now, most of this investment is in hydroelectric dams, and like in Burma, there are big questions being raised about how much these projects will actually benefit Cambodia and how much they'll benefit China. In 2009, Cambodia returned a group of 20 Uyghur refugees to China, despite protests from the US and from the UNHCR. A few days later, China gave Cambodia $1.2 billion in economic assistance, leading to a fair bit of speculation that it was a quid pro quo. WikiLeaks cables released last year quote the Cambodian Deputy Prime Minister admitting that his government was put in a, quote, difficult position due to pressure from outside forces. So what will this mean for Southeast Asian multilateralism and for resolving issues like the South China Sea dispute? At the November East Asia Summit meeting, Cambodia was one of only 2 ASEAN members that did not speak about the South China Sea issue. You'll recall that the other one was Burma, which suggests that Cambodia either implicitly supports China's position or, for whatever reason, it's unwilling to take China to task on this issue, which every other country in the region thought was so pressing. So even though the South China Sea dispute remains unsolved and is in many ways becoming increasingly problematic, it seems quite unlikely that Cambodia will be willing to place it high on the ASEAN agenda in 2012, like Vietnam and Indonesia were willing to do and were very keen to do over the past few years. What this means in terms of America's engagement in the East Asia Summit and in Southeast Asian multilateralism more broadly is that the maritime states now have the backing locked in of a powerful friend that they know will be able to help them push this issue through the summits. And just as an aside, the reason why the Southeast Asian states believe it's so important to have a multilateral solution to the South China Sea disputes is that they realistically know that if they go up against China individually, they're not going to have any hope of getting any kind of outcome they want. So it's really a case of strength in numbers, or it's the only way that they know they can negotiate. And now this issue will become even more important in 2014 when Burma quite controversially takes the chair of ASEAN. In 2013 it's going to be Brunei, which is a US-aligned country but quite a powerless and small country in the context of Southeast Asia. The Burmese case of taking the chair is very interesting. I think it's interesting to reflect on Washington and what it thinks of this. If not for the recent détente, America would have been left with quite an interesting choice. It hasn't had diplomatic, up until the last few months, it hasn't had diplomatic representation in Burma for 20 years. So it'd be left with a choice of boycotting the meetings and effectively ceding influence to China, who is, after the US, by far the most powerful country at any of the meetings, or it would have to choose to start working with the Burmese regime, which it's done. So even though I think the US is very genuine in its moves to support democracy and human rights in Burma, it's not hard to see how there's a strategic element towards its détente as well. What this means is that America's re-engagement with multilateral forums in Southeast Asia goes well beyond simply reassuring its allies and partners of its commitment to the region. It's also a move to shore up its own influence, and it knows that these multilateral dialogues are becoming much more important and much more significant in solving regional security issues. It also knows that investment in multilateral cooperation is a far cheaper way to build influence than by spending money on bilateral military alliances. So we can also see that this is a bit of a hedge against the possibility that America may not always have the budget to maintain its naval primacy in the region. Ultimately, the goal for Southeast Asian states is to ensure that no single power can dominate their region. Many have had relatively recent experiences with colonialism, and like countries all around the world, they value their own sovereignty but also regional autonomy above all else. They believe that binding both major regional powers into bilateral and ASEAN-led cooperation is a bit of an insurance policy. Insurance against the possibility that China's rise might turn out not to be peaceful, or that the US wants to withdraw from the region into isolationism, or that either power can aggressively dominate the region. Southeast Asian states don't want to be dominated by any great power, but they tolerate America's primacy because it's proven to be benign, and they welcome Washington's pivot because it suits their own interests. ultimately, Southeast Asian countries, like Australia, would like to preserve the status quo for as long as possible. They see China as the economic partner who facilitates prosperity, America the security provider who guards the peace. And they hope that America's re-engagement with the region will help them to continue achieving this. Like Australia, Southeast Asian states are facing a future where their biggest economic partner and their biggest security partner are not the same country, and in fact may even become hostile to each other. In fact, Southeast Asian countries are probably even a little bit further down the road than we are of working out how to deal with this reality. Now, ANU Professor Hugh White recently made headlines in Australia with his argument that we should convince the US to allow China to play a larger role in the region, enabling a concert of powers to emerge like turn-of-the-century Europe. But there are big questions about whether the rest of Asia, and especially Southeast Asia, would actually even support this. Southeast Asian states, especially the large maritime states that are the most strategically important, welcome America's pivot. Not because it changes the status quo, but because it's an attempt to preserve it. Thank you.